Welcome back to Tech-Tulia. We have another episode for you today from Guadalajara, Mexico. I'm joined by Vidal Gonzalez.
As usual.
Luckily, we were able to get you to come back for another episode. You're just a returning guest every time.
I am. I was like, I'm the most popular guest you have.
Yeah, it's the only one I can get on this show.
Yeah.
And I'm Matt Pashensky. We're filming out of the Wise Line offices, and we're doing a podcast. We're doing video. We got multiple video angles today, which I'm very excited about. We're improving the overall. Thank you to Q4 Studios. Today, we're actually going to be talking about movie making.
Yeah, in a very interesting way, with a twist, I guess.
Well, we'll see. Hopefully,
we'll see. Oh, yeah.
Hopefully it's interesting. But you read a book about Pixar.
Yeah.
By one of the founders of Pixar.
Yes, sir.
I have another book that I like, and I think we're going to try to, as usual, connect it back to some other themes. But the basics are, there's these franchises now. You look at Pixar, I think is a good franchise. Mm-hmm. Or you have the Marvel universe, you have the Star Wars universe, and now if maybe you're a Quentin Tarantino fan. I just watched the new Quentin Tarantino movie.
Which one?
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Because you were in the U.S. That's why you mean.
Yeah, it hasn't come out here.
Yeah.
So we're filming this in early August. It doesn't come out till late August, which I was like,
cool.
Because I was thinking I was gonna come back and just watch it here.
Yeah.
I'll just give you guys a pet peeve. It costs a lot of money to watch a movie in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Here it's like what, 8 pesos? Or no, 80 pesos?
Yeah. Well,
United
you
States,
need to get popcorn, so, it'll run you 200 pesos.
So the popcorn in the United States is almost 200 pesos. And
that's not bad.
For the popcorn only.
Just the popcorn?
Just the popcorn.
Okay,
and then the movie ticket is like $18-19. This is
Okay.
Anyway, so I'm watching this Quentin Tarantino movie, and the thing about Pixar or Quentin Tarantino or obviously any of the franchises is that there's a consistency to them. Mm-hmm. And there's a style of storytelling that's very powerful, that works very well, and that allows these companies to make enormous amounts of money. It looks like this Quentin Tarantino movie is going to be his most popular. Now, Quentin Tarantino is not a huge moneymaker, but Pixar is. Mm-hmm. And so we'll get into how Pixar does it and their creative process. What's the name of the book?
Creativity Inc.
Creativity Inc. And then I think there's a few principles to storytelling that are really good. But I don't think anything about what these movie companies do is particular to movies, in the sense that it isn't just restricted to making good movies. There's a hell of a lot of bad movies get made too.
Yeah.
That don't share a lot of the principles. But I think everybody could learn a lot from how to tell a good story and how to have a creative way of coming up with a new world and communicating to people.
Yeah, I guess the most interesting thing that I saw or that I learned about Creativity Inc. is the similarities between creating a company that does movies to creating a company that does anything close to creative work. Meaning, if you have a company that produces podcast or whatever, if there's such thing, there might be certain aspects of that company that are shared with a company that does movies, with a company that does software, with a company that does UX design or something, right? So that is
Q4 is in the room. They're nodding their head. They've pulled out their notebooks. They're going to be taking notes. I think the quality of the podcast since we started, I just want to take people on the journey. This is like our 12th, 11th, 10th, some number above 10 episodes. And we've gone from just audio to now we have audio and video, and now we have the multiple camera angles, which I think will spice up the visual look. But we think a lot about movies when we're communicating, whether in our companies. So when we come back, we will talk about Creativity Inc.
Sounds good.
So the book you read was called Creativity Inc.
Yep.
And Pixar, when it first started, actually was not a movie company, right?
No, it wasn't. And it was a company developing computers to process graphics, and a very specialized computer that was extremely expensive. They were actually going to go out of business because they were building computers that nobody could basically used. Like, there were very little. The market was very small.
And
right?
so they needed to come up with a product that justified buying all these computers.
Yeah, and the whole story probably it's a bit fuzzy because it's been a while and I'm getting old. But the thing is, they switched, right? Steve Jobs decided to invest in a company because he thought they were a computer manufacturing company. They wanted to buy them for their computer making abilities. When in reality, most of the thing that was valuable about that company was about the software and around the team that could develop an animated movie, right, through the use of machinery as well as computing.
And so they had to create, like, basically they couldn't sell the computers.
Nope.
They had to create a movie to justify the computers or to show what they could do, and that movie was Toy Story.
Yeah. So, but the most interesting thing, and I guess I think we're not making it justice to tell the story about exactly how Pixar came to be, and it's intentionally because you need to read the book.
Yeah, this is a podcast. Go read books. You lazy. They have books on tape. You do one day a podcast. We only come out like once every week, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Let's get the book, read it on tape. Gives you plenty of time between episodes.
Exactly. But the main point is, one of the things that clicked with me so much, and I guess I'm deviating from the main discussion that we want to have today, but hopefully not, is Ed Campbell's idea of making it in life.
And that's the guy who wrote the book, Ed.
The guy that wrote the book, but the guy that also basically founded Pixar. He said, once I made my first computer-generated animation movie, I was like, is this it? What's the next thing for me? And the most interesting thing about Ed is that he realized how the goal now was to actually create a company where creativity and excellence was what drove a group of people. His job was no longer to tell a story and design characters through computer animation. His job was to create a company and design it and give it the instrumentation so that more animation films could be done. Mm-hmm. And that's I think the beauty of Creativity Inc. I was just looking at a Goodreads. Goodreads.com is a website where many people review the book. And funny enough, many people give it bad ratings because they thought, and one person is saying it here, they were looking for a guidebook of inspiration on creativity. And I think they didn't read it through. Here's my point.
Well, there's two words in the title: creativity, which is probably where they stopped, and then Inc., which stands for incorporated, which is a company, a business thing.
Right. No, but the main point of it is you're missing the point if you don't understand that creating something requires a certain environment. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also where it relates to creating any other type of company. Like if you think of the Silicon Valley, if you think of what makes Google successful, a lot of the things that make Pixar successful are shared by Apple itself, are shared by Google today, are shared by Amazon and others, right? Albeit Amazon is not from the Silicon Valley. But the point is, you need to create a culture within an organization that is very open for confrontation, but healthy one. They speak about a concept called psychological safety. And I'm speaking about management terms. And one of the best reviews that I've seen thus far is that, right? Like people that understand that they came in for an inside story about how Pixar was created, but the outcome of them reading the book was, oh, this is the best book I've seen on how to create a culture that fosters creativity, which is nobody will give you a recipe for how to be creative on your own. Like that is a journey on its own. You need to be able to create an environment around you, either as a lone creator or as a company that creates stuff for it to be successful. And it's quite interesting.
So instead of focusing so much on what if we had a toy who could talk, think about, hey, if we do have a good idea that everyone likes, how do we make sure that idea actually makes it to production? Yeah. Versus focusing about I need to have so many good ideas right now because I need to be creative.
Yeah. And I'm I'm missing a word because they create something called, so at Wiseline, I implemented this, we call it the delivery trust because it's intended for delivery. I think, what do they call it? I don't know, something trust, forgive me. But the idea is that anybody within Pixar can use the trust, which is a kind of meeting where you come in and you present your character, right?
Mm-hmm.
You present your character, you describe your story, and you present a challenge. For example, let's say I am portraying Woody in this particular situation with Buzz Lightyear, and I really cannot get a handle of how to make this really relatable to the audience, right? And the idea with this brain trust, got it now. Brain trust within Pixar is to be in a space where the rest of the people around your team can give you ideas on how to solve that issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the key of it is it's a safe place where you can be vulnerable and just say the struggles that you're going through. People can be super frank and tell you that idea of how you're trying to make Buzz Lightyear interact with Woody is super dumb. I think you should do it like this. Now, I guess the word dumb might look like a very direct attack on your persona, but it's you should choose the right set of words that will be very compelling for the other person to actually consider
what's interesting,
it.
That seems a lot like the culture at Apple. When you hear about the exact, like when they were inventing the iPhone or some of these innovative products that eventually became huge, just a lot about not only Steve Jobs being very direct,
right?
Because he's kind of the central character.
Yeah.
But then also other people being very direct with Steve Jobs or with each other, having this culture where, you're not going to be kind of ostracized for being wrong or even for being mean. I think that's another part of it. I read about obviously there had to be this guy, but there was like an investor who was getting pitched for Google's seed round, which is the initial, the first money. So if you think about how much Google's worth at the time, probably less than $1 million, right?
Yeah.
Now it's an $800 billion company.
Yeah.
And so Larry Page came in and was pitching to this investor. And the investor kind of liked the idea of Google, but thought Larry Page was an asshole and super arrogant.
Yeah.
And so he passed on the investment. And then, obviously, like 2-3 years later, it's the biggest company in it's like the hottest company. And like as missing that from a seed round is like a giant mistake.
Of course.
And the investment firm decided like, yeah, we're not going to pass on companies just because the CEO is a little arrogant. And honestly, when you're Larry Page and you have Google, maybe it's right to be arrogant. But not to justify arrogance, but to justify a wider range of emotion and interaction in a safer environment where you don't attack people personally, but you're allowed to not be so conscious about your own behavior.
No, and honestly, I can relate to that story because I personally am the type of personality that doesn't like confrontation. And for the majority of my career, I've come little by little to embrace confrontation because it is healthy. Like, it is healthy that somebody that thinks very differently from you, has a different very opinion of what you're saying, challenges you directly. The one thing is that person across from you better be very smart, right? Like, because he's going to be coming to you with a very contrary idea to yours. He needs to be very smart because otherwise it's like, yeah, man, it's just your opinion. And that's when things escalate. You need to respect the intellect of that person. Right?
And I think that something that Wiseline very early on that I liked, we used to do this, is we would have meetings where we just, the founders or eventually the group of especially executive leaders would just get together and we would be very, very direct. And we would just have like a session and it was like always like I was always like sweaty going into it. you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
we would sit there and like everybody else and like eventually got to like went from like the 4 of us to like 8 or 9 people and they would just sit there and they're like, man, I think that you do this wrong and you don't do that very well and you could do this better.
Yeah.
And what was amazing about it, it was always way more valuable than you thought. And once it was over, with people being direct, not mean, but direct and in ways that would inflict harm otherwise. But when you have that space, I felt so much more excited and I trusted the company so much more because I knew what I needed to do. I knew where I was going wrong and I felt like I had more direction.
Yeah.
And I feel like in other times, you get into situations where you have a lot of people involved in a big project, and you don't have those direct lines of feedback. You kind of get lost. You kind of just like, you don't know what's up or down. You don't know if other people are excited about you or excited about what you're doing or your project, or they're just nodding their head because they don't want to get in a fight right now.
Yeah.
And it leads to just kind of like no one really having any clue what's the absolute next thing we need to do and where's the direction of this whole project going.
Yeah, and another great thing that I learned about this experience of basically having a look at how movies that have been so influential for all of us are made is it's a very grueling process. Like, you would think an environment like Pixar is like everybody has plush toys around and everybody's enjoying their job, working very, very little potentially because they're creative people, right? And they only need to invest a couple of hours to just make things happen. And like, no, it is like any other company, and it is grueling and like long hours and hard work. And that's what I think people confuse these days, especially when setting up to build a company and setting up to build the right culture to be a very creative and innovative company is, at the end of the day, still you need to work very hard, and still you need to be able to hold each other accountable for your results. And I think, when I worked with you at Wiseline, that's the thing that comes across from you is like, we need to hold each other very accountable for what we say. And you had this idea about contract, remember? Like, people need to say something, I'm going to do this by a certain date, and actually deliver it, right?
Yeah, so much of trust is believing in the integrity of your relationships.
Right.
And that goes in terms of, is this person telling me exactly what's on their mind?
Right.
Which is very important. And you much rather piss someone off a little bit, but have everybody come away thinking, you know what, that person's going to tell me exactly what they're thinking.
Yeah.
Versus having no idea what really happened in that room.
Yeah.
And then second is when someone tells you they're going to do something.
Yeah.
That it actually gets done, right?
Yeah.
And if you have those two pieces, both in terms of like this person is saying what they mean, and then when they say something, it's actually going to happen, totally changes stuff. And again, how do you is creativity just about being personally like creative and having a lot of ideas? Not really.
No.
It's about having the people around you to get it done.
Yeah.
And there's things you can be like, you want to do a home project and remodel your house. You probably don't need anybody else, but you want to build a company, you want to make a movie. It takes thousands of people.
Exactly.
And that means having a lot of a creative environment. And I think we just kind of defined that. All right. Well, let's wrap this up. We have two more topics. We're going to talk about. So far we've talked about kind of. I know we kicked the movie. That's off saying we're going to talk about movies, and then all we talked about is business culture. We'll get some bad reviews.
We did say something about Toy Story.
Good reads. Like, this was supposed to be about movies and creativity.
Yeah.
And then it was just about business and having meetings. But guess what, kids? That's life.
That is life.
Even if you're at Pixar, it's just a bunch of meetings and reviews and lots of hard work.
I mean, there's probably a topic for another episode, but there's also this concept of doing work that is purposeful or exciting for you, and work that you actually enjoy. Because there's a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, you should enjoy what you do." Yes, but you should also do it with purpose, and it actually will be hard. So, I mean, I think Pixar is a great example of all of the people that think that they should be changing their jobs just because the current one is hard. Let me tell you how even at Pixar, things are super hard.
Well, let's use that as a segue, because if you have purposeful work, it's meaningful work. It can be terrible and unpleasant, but you still like doing it in some sense, versus work that could be a lot of fun, but you end up feeling like, what's going on? Why am I doing this with my life? And so when we come back, there's a book I like that we're going to talk about, it's called Story. And it talks about how to generate meaning, essentially.
All right.
So let's come back and talk about that. So this book is called Story. It's by Robert McKee. And again, we're going to change the name of the podcast to Book Review with Matt and Vidal. That's what happens when you have nerds.
I know.
So this book is called Story by Robert McKee. It's a book for people who write scripts.
Okay.
It's like an instructional manual. And I used to live with a guy who wrote movies and television stuff.
Nice.
And so he had this book on his bookshelf, and I read it. And it was really, really good. And I think everyone in business and whatever field you're in, if you're leading people to some kind of new ideas, you need to understand storytelling and you need to practice it.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I'm listening to a book called Made to Stick.
What's that about?
It's about how you should tell ideas.
Can we skip to less than 10 books per podcast episode?
Let's not jump into Made to Stick because I'm at the beginning of it, but it's interesting because I agree. Like, if you don't convey a good message through a story that is factual and people can relate to, you're not a good leader.
Yeah. And so anyway, story gives you a lot of good tips, and it goes through movies in particular. But when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is great. And then one time I tried to get somebody to read it for business, and they were like, I don't understand at all what you're talking about, Matt. This book's too dense. So I don't know if it's a good business book, but for me, I really got a lot out of it from a leadership perspective, just because how do you get everybody on board with some big new idea you have, or tell a story that's compelling?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'll do is I think there's like this one kind of little trick that underlies it. There's a lot of detailed, make your, if you're writing a character, you're writing a scene, there's tips. But there's this kind of one core element to storytelling that I think I can get across in the podcast. But you should read the book if you like it.
Okay.
And in particular, I think all of the movies that I really like fall in the type of storytelling that Robert McKee talks about in this book. And it's this. A good book or a good movie or a good pitch deck talks about one major change, right?
Okay.
And that's kind of a dramatic unity to it. You're not talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. So if I hear somebody come pitch me a company that they're starting and they say, well, I'm going to be doing this and this and this and this, it's kind of like, well, pick one thing. And same thing with the movie. If you got 10 different characters and they're all doing things that are somewhat thematically related.
Right.
People make those movies, some people like them, but I like it where all the characters come together at the end
for a single thing
and they make one big change. And that's why you've picked that story, because it's one major change going to happen. So if you look at the Marvel movies, there was these Marvel movies that came out recently, Avengers Endgame, what was Infinity War and Endgame, right? And there's one thing they had to do, which is defeat Thanos. Now you might say, okay, that's dumb, Matt. That's whatever. I like the kids movies too. Like they're not kids movies. They're for mid-30s nostalgia weirdos. But the reason I like it is because you have all of these different characters, and they're all going to combine together to accomplish one person. And if you think about like, hey, what is my company supposed to do? Yeah. You get a whole bunch of people coming together and they're going to solve one purpose. And a great company doesn't talk about, hey, we're going to make money in any different way that we can. Eventually that happens. And eventually in a movie, there's like side plots that aren't exactly the most important. But as long as there's one major thrust of something right now is broken and we're going to fix it, that's a comedy if you're in a drama standpoint. Like, I'm down on my luck, but then I meet a magical fairy, and then they make me look good, and then I find love, and then I'm happy at the end. Right? That's like, but the basic Cinderella story, right? Everyone talks about Cinderella story in those terms. Like, she starts off, she's the poorest and unhappiest she could possibly be. She goes through a lot of trouble, but then at the end, she's the happiest she could possibly be. So you have to break down your story into one single movement at the highest level. Does that make sense?
It does. And it made me wonder, can I make you a very weird question?
It's your podcast.
What's Pulp Fiction about?
That's a very good question. Well, you're really putting me on the spot.
Yeah, because I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was like,
spoiler alert, I'm going to completely spoil Pulp Fiction.
Stop here if you haven't watched one of the greatest movies
ever. If you have not watched Pulp Fiction. So I think the main character in Pulp Fiction is Jules.
Okay.
Right? But obviously it's very convoluted. But you have a bunch of main characters. If any one of the main characters, you can see exactly where their story. For me, Jules starts out as a hitman.
Right.
Who's and then he has this event happens what makes him question his whole world, which is he almost gets killed.
Yeah.
And he can't understand why he didn't die because he came out with a hand cannon and there was bullets right behind him. And then throughout the movie, even though it's happening not in a straightforward linear order,
right,
you understand the world that Jules lives in, why it's appealing, but also why he has to leave. And at the end, he walks away from it. Okay. And that's the last shot. Now, Robert McKee would say you need to start your movie by setting off the central tension of the movie, and then you got to resolve that tension by the end.
Right.
So I think for me, the story is really about Jules. Vincent, it's obviously not about Vincent. Vincent's just chilling out with Jules.
Yeah.
You could say that it's about the Butch, who's Bruce Willis's character, the boxer.
Yeah.
But he has a very similar story arc, which he's in it and he makes it out by choosing not to kill Ving Rhames, but walk away from violence. So the whole movie is about people in a very violent situation who eventually choose not to pursue violence. Ving Rhames as Marcellus Wallace.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is now just a long exegesis of what Pulp Fiction is. But I think that's what makes the movie good. It's a whole bunch of people. You love the violence. Everybody loves the violence. But it's about a whole bunch of people leaving it behind in the same way.
I have to tip my hat to you, sir, because I threw you a curveball and you handled it like a champ. So that was a good answer. I love it. I think that proves the point. Yeah, I mean, we are animals of very short memory and things that we can relate to, right? And like a guy that is in a pretty shitty situation of violence, making it out alive, intact, and probably reflecting, was like, yeah, we should probably do something.
And he says, like, I should have been dead.
Yeah.
And they all abandon violence at the end and are happier for it. Like, but when you talk about what's your company, everyone's just like, you're just hanging in there. And I think the dream for every company is that you eventually get enough money that you don't have to worry anymore.
Right.
But that's not a very good story.
Money is never the goal.
Yeah, and if you look at what Steve Jobs talked about, getting it back to Pixar, and maybe what he took away from Pixar as much as what he put into Pixar.
Yeah.
What he learned being the CEO or the head of owner of Pixar was telling a very clear story. And actually, it was probably all Steve Jobs, because when he, you remember the 1984 commercial for the Mac? It was like all these drones marching into a room, and then this blonde woman comes in and throws this hammer through a screen. He's like, I'm blowing up computers, right?
Right.
Like the old computers are gone, the new computers are here.
Right.
It's very important to have those central imagery of like, what is your product? I'm going to take the boring world of business computers and give you a creative computer. And then with the iPhone, really the Johnny Ive aesthetic of, we're going to take your complicated life and make it simple.
Oh, yeah.
Smooth.
Yeah.
Complete. Single screen, no keyboard, simplicity.
And I believe when they presented the iPhone, they even said, we're going to combine a web browser, a phone, and I don't remember the third thing. And probably it was pictures or something, right? Like, no, music. It was the browser.
The iPod.
Yeah. A phone and a browser.
And then it kept going around, and then it all combined together. Yeah.
So it delivers a very clear, simplistic thing that people can remember.
Yeah. And contrast that, like the simple, clear movement of like, you didn't have these things and now they're all together, and that's so different and so much better. That's what every movie's telling you. Yeah. Is like every Avengers movie, for better or worse, is always when we learn to work together as a team, we can overcome anything. Like that's always the theme. That's always what the movie ends up telling. And it's kind of like boring in some sense, but on the other hand, it keeps the whole thing together and everybody knows what they're supposed to think.
Yeah.
Which, as I say it like that, it kind of sounds bad. But like in a company, that's the most important thing. You want all of your customers, all of your employees to know, hey, what are we all doing here? Because we're getting paid, but that's not why I'm showing up for work. That's not why I picked this company. That's not why I'm going to put in the long hours and make those, choices that could be embarrassing. I'm here for a story.
Yeah.
And if you can't tell that story in one light switch of like, it used to be like this, and then you flick the switch and now it's totally different.
Yeah.
Then you got to work harder on your storytelling, according to Robert McKee.
Does it, and I'm going to throw another curveball, and I don't know if I'm extending this section too much.
We can just cut it out if I fail, all right?
Yeah.
Mark the time.
But as I started discovering these services like Spotify and whatnot, and I started seeing the amount of creative work as it relates to music was being generated on these platforms, I wonder, would this thing get old, music, or repetitive, right? And I see that in movies sometimes, like the amount of movies that I can watch on Netflix right now, and a lot of them follow the same plot, follow a main character doing something. I'll bet some very revolutionary work like the work that Tarantino does or the Coen brothers do is like just like blows your mind. But honestly, the majority of it is just following a set of steps and recipes. And I wonder if movie creation or certain forms of art will start to get old. What do you think?
Well, talking about the basic story structure, this goes back to Greek times. There's two basic formats, and the reason there's comedies and tragedies.
Okay.
And there's only two.
Right.
And I'll prove to you mathematically why there's only two types of stories.
All right.
Because there has to be a movement from being not doing well, like Cinderella.
Okay.
And then at the end doing very well.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and this is very rare in modern, and I think people should, I think one of the great things about Infinity War and Endgame is actually a tragedy.
Okay.
A tragedy about our hero, who was Thanos.
Okay.
And actually, the Avengers are just there to screw with him, and they're all a bunch of weirdos in suits, and he's the only one who has like a good idea of what's going on and control. But he goes from having all of this stuff. He starts off the movie, he's got the Infinity Stones, he's building up, but eventually, because, and it's not really like Thanos has like a tragic flaw, so it's not a great tragedy, but like he eventually falls. So he starts high and ends low. And that's why there's only two. You can either start low and high, start high and low, but that's basically it. Everything else would be like, well, you started low and ended low. Like, no one wants to watch that movie. And starting high and ending high is a common thing, but it's also boring.
Yeah.
And so that's why, since Greek times. So, you think about bits, like, well, it's just zeros and ones. How many things can we do with it? You can do quite a bit.
Yeah.
And as, you talk about software as just zeros and ones, there's so many permutations and so many ways for it to interact with your life that can be interesting. I think as storytelling evolves, the mediums that you're telling stories on, the types of ways that people can involve themselves in the stories themselves are changing. The production values are getting much lower, so you can do podcasts. And, so I think there's a lot of things that are changing about how stories can be told, but there's only a few basic stories in the same way that there's only two types of bit, zeros and ones. It's kind of like there's some fundamental mathematical properties to it that limit you, but you can't just look at limitations and saying, well, there's squares, triangles, and circles. How many shapes can we make? It's like, well, you put them together in the right way, you can tell almost any human story through those things.
That's a good answer.
All right, we'll stop it there. We got one more. We're going to come back. Hopefully, the Brain Trust, who has decided to become Techtulia listeners,
there you go,
can join us. We're going to have a kind of an idea. We're going to pop it out. Hopefully someone just takes this because we don't have any free time. We have just enough to do the podcast, but hopefully there can be someone picks this idea and up and runs with it. So we'll come up with another business idea going all the way back to episode 2 or 3, and we'll come up with a new startup idea, and you can tell us what you think in the comments.
Nice.
Okay, as usual, we've saved the most experimental, possibly the best, possibly the worst. You're rolling the dice when you stay to the end of an episode, and
I like that expression.
It was just we were talking on Friday about an idea. So about Marvel.
Yep.
I'm mostly talking to the audience. You know about Marvel. Now, Marvel was a comic book company, but the thing is, these days, they make very little of their money from comics compared to the movies.
Yeah.
And in the end, the valuation of Marvel, when they sold it to Disney for like $4 billion, which has to be like one of these great acquisitions like Instagram. Like, they're making so much money off it, Disney is, after they acquired Marvel from its previous owners. But it wasn't in the ability to sell the comic books. It was in the ability to make movies based on the comic books. Like, that was the real value. And so we were chatting on the phone after work, and talking about how could you build a similar environment for creating these stories and characters and environments that are licensable IP that can be sold, but in a way, because you can't start with a whole Marvel universe from one character. It takes a long time to get there. Yeah. So I mean, like, you kind of pitch it back to me. What did you remember from our conversation on Friday? We'll see if we can get something that's like a real. I think there's a business in here somewhere.
Yeah, I thought, like, I mean, what is the today's equivalent of Marvel? Like, did they start in a garage and start like writing down characters and scribing the whole story? Was it a single person? Was it multiple people? And then how do you come about providing a platform, like you said, a universe for many people to write and develop many plots, but within the same constraints of that main universe, right?
Right. And I think, you look at Stan Lee created a lot of the characters. Yeah. But then other artists came in and created updates or refreshes. And over the years, that allowed a lot of experimentation. And then when they went to go to the movies, they have all these comic books. And they can say, you know what? Here's what we think Thor really is. Right. And actually, the first two movies from Thor sucked. But then they figured out he was a comedy character. And like the last movie in Thor, he's been fantastic, right? Like after Ragnarok, but it's that experimentation and getting to know the characters. Right. It's something that you don't see in a lot of movies. And actually, Star Wars, which has its own universe, they made a mistake because instead of taking, there was a lot of lore and existing books after the original Star Wars, and they bought all that. Yeah. And then instead of saying, hey, we're going to take the existing stories and the existing characters and that have already been figured out and kind of like solidified and all the loose ends tied up. Yeah. They just went in and threw it all out and said, we're going to make new characters. Yeah. And so you lose all of that thought and experimentation about how the world fits together and how it makes sense. I think a lot of people feel that the last season of Game of Thrones.
I was going to say that. I was going to throw a bomb, and I was going to say that I bet you that if this thing existed for Game of Thrones, somebody would have come up with a better ending for that thing.
Absolutely. Well, right? and because they went from writing really great ways to tell a story that already existed, right, to then having to figure out a new story. Yeah. And they were very good at filming existing stories. You're giving me, exactly, right? And but they were they were not good at creating new stories.
No, it's hard.
And it's hard. And I think the reason the George R. R. Martin hasn't finished the books is because he doesn't even know how it's going to finish. No. And it just takes him a long time of sitting down and writing and writing and writing. Yeah. And I think the amazing thing about Marvel is that even though there's like 30 or 40 characters in Endgame, you care about all of them. Right. And they all have thought out characteristics and stories and character arcs that they're going through, movements from being weak to being strong, from being arrogant to being humble, all of those things that are like so valuable in storytelling, they were able to weave it all together because it was all sitting there kind of already planned out. Yeah. And so there's something hugely valuable about creating shared universes that allow you to basically make sure your story has an internal integrity.
And I guess the real heavy lifting in putting together a company platform, whatever that is, that does something like this is figuring out how much heavy lifting do you need to do until a certain universe or storyline actually becomes something that people can create on top of. Yeah. Right?
So let's go right into what the idea was for a company. And it's not really even a tech company. It's like maybe like a licensing legal company, but I'm sure there'd be like a tech thing to it. But basically what you would do is you would start a universe. Let's say somebody writes a really cool story. Yeah. Right? And then instead of it just being that person would get ownership over that universe. Right. It might have imagine it was a story about cyber narcos in future Culiacan or something like that, right? Okay. Like, just imagine that. Like that'd be an interesting setting. I think that'd be a fun story, right? Yeah. So he writes one interesting story and everybody else is like, oh man, that's amazing. Yeah. Right now, a lot of times because of intellectual property, what happens is that's the only person who can write about it or one other person. But if instead that person opened it up and said, we're going to have a universe of this stuff. Right. And you can write for it. And if it's good, we'll accept it into the universe.
And I guess you, as the creator of the universe, are the curator of what people bring in.
Exactly. So instead of George R.R. Martin being the only one who could tell the story, and then they ran out of story, and then it was these two guys who were not really that good at telling stories, which is D&D, according to the fan sites that are quite mad at them. Instead, it was George R.R. Martin creates the first couple books, and then people should start put them out, and then George R.R. Martin can say, "Hey, these ones are canon. I like these," or work with the art, imagine 10 books get created after the first one. Work with them. Hey, I want these things to change, so to create internal consistency. But at the end, that's very much what Marvel did. Each book changed a little bit, but they kept enough the same, and they curated it to an extent that it became a consistent, coherent, meaningful space to develop in.
And there's always a tech angle for everything, because I believe that already happens in open source software, right? Like you have Linus Torvalds, where like he created Linux, yet he's the creator, but also the curator of everything that goes into the Linux core. And he's done a pretty good job at keeping it all consistent and sticky.
I'm sure there's already LitHub. I'm like almost remember that there's LitHub. Let me look it up. But yeah, like a literature GitHub.
Yeah, and in this case is you need to take your project to a certain level of evolution that people can start contributing to it in an effective way.
There is a LitHub, but it's about congregating to celebrate books. It's not congregating to write books. So I think there's...
And I think the interesting thought process about this idea is, can this really be done in a kind of team setting way? Because evidently Marvel was not a single person, right?
No, obviously it was hundreds and hundreds of illustrators and writers.
And it's probably that we are not that deep into that industry, but it's an interesting thought experiment of creating a company that can allow that in the year 2019.
I really like that analogy. Linus is the Stan Lee of Linux.
Yes, he is.
And I think creating those creative platforms because everyone complains about sequels all the time, but I think sequels are just a creative platform. Yeah. It's like none of the Marvel movies are the same as any of the other ones. Like they're all technically sequels. They're all technically, but you go and see a movie like Thor Ragnarok, which I really liked. It was such a departure from previous superhero movies and a lot of like anything I'd ever seen before in terms of its stylistic kind of and the level they went to it with. But it goes back to what you were saying at Pixar, which is when you're sure that every movie you're going to put out already has an audience, right? As long as you make a good movie, it's going to make a lot of money. Yeah. So you don't need to make a standard movie. But if you're coming out with something, and like, Pixar, Pixar is going to be good. Right. So when they say, hey, we made a movie about a robot, you're like, this is going to be some crazy movie. Right. And Wall-E comes out and you're like, this is incredible. And everyone went and saw it. But if you are starting from scratch and you're not starting within a creative supportive environment, then you come up with some idea, but it doesn't go, people don't come to watch the movie. Or if you're in a company that's not supportive, you come up with a great idea, but no, everyone's like, I'm busy, I can't worry about that, or that's stupid. Yeah. And it never goes anywhere. Yeah. But within this kind of platform of Marvel, where everyone knows that Marvel doesn't put out terrible movies, that you're at least going to be entertained, and you know the characters, and you know what you're in for, and then they know that you're going to come. So it actually creates, I think, a lot of room for creativity that didn't exist before these franchises. Yeah. And I think the central thing is like, how do you do that at a smaller scale and allow for new franchises and new universes? Because Marvel's eventually going to run out of steam. Maybe not, but probably will.
Like most things. I like that idea a lot. And
so anyway, break down if you want to start this business, you need to go figure out how to create the intellectual property, license it, divide up equity ownership. If you're writing a book, you get an ownership share of the universe. You get some amount of creative control over the universe, like some kind of voting share. There has to be some mechanism we haven't figured out. Yeah. And then you get movie revenue off of the books you create and revenue off of the universes you share. And in the event that the universe is sold to Disney, which is going to eventually buy up everything.
Every story in the world.
Every story will eventually be just under Disney. Yep. Then you would get a share of the proceeds. So that's the business. GitHub for storytelling. Love it. Anyway,
great idea.
That's Techtulia for this week. Please subscribe. We're on YouTube. We're on Twitter. We're on Anchor. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts. You can anywhere. And Q4 Studios is tracking all of our analytics for us and sending us the reports. So thank you guys.
And we're going to owe you on that restaurant review, but we need to figure it out for the next episode.
We did no taco content this week. I know that's disappointing, but believe us, we will fix it next time.
Yes.